literature from Columbia, so a lifelong Columbia learner. He was director of the Center for the Core Curriculum at Columbia from 2008 to 2018. I can't imagine doing this job for 10 years, so that's very impressive. Roosevelt specializes in antebellum American literature and culture, with a particular interest in American citizenship. His dissertation, Rethinking America, Abolitionism and the Antebellum Transformation of the Discourse of National Identity, won Columbia University's 2004 Bancroft Award. In 2000, he received the Presidential Award for Outstanding Teaching by a Graduate Student. Dr. Montás teaches Introduction to Contemporary Civilization in the West, a year-long course on primary texts in moral and political thought, as well as seminars in American studies, including Freedom and Citizenship in the United States. He is director of the Center for American Studies Freedom and Citizenship program in collaboration with the Double Discovery Center. He speaks and writes on the history, meaning, and future of liberal education, and is the author of Rescuing Socrates, How the Great Books Changed My Life and Why They Matter for a New Generation. Thank you so much for being here, and come on up.
Thank you all for being here. And thank you, Professor Lucy, for your introduction, and Professor Haynes for your introduction of her and me, and for reaching out to me. I'm thrilled to be here this afternoon, thrilled to become better acquainted with your program here, with some of you faculty members that I've met, and students we've, I think, already have had a quite substantive set of conversations. And thank you for making the time to come and be part of, of this event today. It always strikes me how attention is our most on-demand resource that we have these days. So I don't take lightly the gift of your attention to me this afternoon. And it's a great honor to come and speak to you today about liberal education. Liberal education is an old subject, but I think it's one that can never be very far from the mind of anyone who cares about human freedom and about what it means to educate for freedom. And besides that kind of perennial importance of the subject, liberal education today is also a pressing issue in higher education as colleges and universities face pressures that push liberal education to the sidelines. It's also a broader sense that I hope will become clear to you as I speak, in which there is a broader cultural significance to the place of liberal education at this moment. It seems to me that part of the crisis of democracy and the political crisis that we find ourselves in some ways reflects a failure of liberal education. That is, that we as a society have not done a good enough job educating our democratic polity in this way, in the way that has been described as liberal education. So as Jen said, last year I published this book, Rescuing Socrates, How the Great Books Changed My Life and Why They Matter for a New Generation. For some years before writing the book, and more intensely since, I've traveled the country talking about the nature of liberal education and about the imperative, at a time like this, for colleges to take seriously their mission of educating students liberally. I have emphasized the urgency of making liberal education accessible to people from what we call marginalized communities, people who have not had access to the resources, opportunities, and privileges that most people who attend college have had access to. And throughout, drawing on my own experience, I've emphasized a model of liberal education based on the reading and discussion in small seminars of what are sometimes called great books, or to put it more descriptively, texts of major cultural significance. Now here at Providence College, a place that embraces its mission as a liberal arts college, I count myself as speaking to a friendly audience, which is not always the case. Even so, I hope that I can say things today that will not only affirm what you already know, but invite deeper reflection on just what it is we're doing here. What is this education we are pursuing? And what is at stake when we promote it or we neglect it? Before getting into all of that, let me say something by way of preliminary. I was told that there would be many students in the audience, and I see that that is, in fact, the case. In preparing my remarks, I have had that especially in mind. So let me begin by saying this to you specifically, students. Liberal education is the part of your education that isn't directly aimed at preparing you for a career. The part of your education that is not directly relevant to any particular profession or occupation. Liberal education is that portion of your education that is due to you from us by virtue of your humanity. The part of your education that sees you not as a professional in the making, but as a whole human being, and that tries to equip you to face that condition in all of its mystery and complexity. One of the things that sets liberal education apart from other kinds of education is that the focus of liberal education is on the student. It's not on the subject, it's not on a discipline, it's not on a body of knowledge, but on the student. The goals and aims of liberal education revolve around the full development and flourishing of students as individual, particular, unique human beings. Now, some of you came to college specifically with the goal of pursuing a liberal education, which is not the same as majoring in the liberal arts. You can and should get a liberal education regardless of what major you pursue. An undergraduate curriculum that does not provide students with a solid liberal education regardless of the major they choose is a fatally defective curriculum. I can't help but admire those of you who came to college specifically looking for a liberal education. When I applied to college, I knew very little about higher education. Though I ended up at an Ivy League university, when I applied to college, I didn't know what the Ivy League was, nor what a research university was, nor what a liberal education was. And I can't help but wonder what it would have taken to get a student like the one I was in high school to grasp the meaning of a liberal education. As it happens, I attended, and excuse this cough I have young children who keep bringing things to my house and to me. At least I know it's not COVID because I had that a month ago. Also, I'm past the contagious stage, so don't be worried, especially you people in the front row. So I did end up at the one major research university that has a required great books liberal arts curriculum. It's required of all students, regardless of the major. And it takes up most of the first 2 years of study at Columbia College. The way in which that intellectual experience expanded and transformed my inner life drives much of what I do to this day. So the question returns, what would it have taken to communicate to me when I was a low-income, immigrant, and first-generation high school student what a liberal education at the college level means? It strikes me as a task of the greatest importance to expand the reach of liberal education to people who have been traditionally excluded from it. This matters to national life because we cannot have a prosperous society, a thriving society, a healthy society that is divided by privileges of birth and where individuals are structurally denied the tools for participation in collective self-governance. I think we have slowly come to realize that freedom is not only a question of rights. The legal scaffold of rights, laws, and the fair administration of justice, it turns out, is only the beginning. For these rights to mean something, for these rights to carry social force, we need to educate individuals that understand themselves as having the rights to have rights. We need a form of education that is premised on our fundamental condition of freedom. In my experience, when people are given a taste of what a liberal education is and what it does, they want it for themselves and for their children. People have an impulse towards freedom and self-determination, a hunger for truth and self-transcendence that makes liberal education immediately compelling. It's not true that all students want from their college education is a job. No matter how much the broader culture tells them that this is what they should want, it does not succeed in beating out of them needs and aspirations that can only be satisfied by non-economic goods. They long for an education that addresses their entire humanity, not just their stomachs and their pockets. An education that not only teaches them things, but which transforms them. An education that's not just about making a better living, but about living a better life. Let me try to specify what I mean by a liberal education. The term is not well understood even among academics. And of course, in the general public, it gets very cold reception, combining the political baggage of the word liberal with the reputed uselessness of studying art. The idea of liberal education goes back to the ancient democracy of Athens, where it was conceived as the education appropriate for free citizens. The word liberal is related to liberty, right? It means concerning freedom. Aristotle described liberal education as an education given not because it is useful or necessary, but because it is noble and suitable for a free person. Now, all Athenian citizens, the kinds of free persons that Aristotle had in mind, participated in government by voting directly on the adoption of laws, holding political office, deliberating on juries, and serving in the army. The point of liberal education was to prepare citizens for these civic responsibilities. To this day, democracies depend on a citizenry capable of discharging the duties for which liberal education prepared Athenian citizens. Indeed, the possibility of democracy hinges on the success or failure of liberal education. In the slave democracy of Athens, and it's notable that Athens was a slave democracy, and that there is a historic association between slavery and democracy, including our own. In that slave democracy, liberal education was distinguished from the education of an enslaved person or of a vulgar craftsman. Today, liberal education is distinguished from professional, technical, or vocational education. Liberal education looks to the meaning of a human life beyond the requirements of existence. Instead of asking how to make a living, liberal education asks what living is for. These studies, says Aristotle, are undertaken for their own sake, whereas those relating to work are necessary and for the sake of things other than themselves. So liberal education addresses the human yearning to go beyond questions of survival to questions of existence. And it concerns itself with a condition we all share, the condition of freedom. This is a condition that we share by virtue of what Marx called our species being. Now, there are, of course, lots of ways in which we're not free. We are constrained on every side, enmeshed in contingency, subject to biological and evolutionary imperatives, driven by psychic forces, social forces, and historical forces beyond our control, and sometimes even beyond our grasp. In the political sphere, injustice and persistent forms of inequality mean that many individuals cannot even enjoy the basic liberties that modern democracies have been organized to secure. So in some ways, we're not free. And in some ways, some of us are more free than others. Yet, our condition as human beings brings along an immediate and fundamental experience of freedom. Let me give you two examples of the way in which our humanity, our condition as human beings brings about this immediate and fundamental experience of freedom. One of them, perhaps less obvious, in which this subjective experience of freedom manifests itself is in our capacity for self-reflection. Notice that self-reflection cannot have a predetermined outcome. Self-reflection is an expression of our radical freedom. Self-reflection changes us. It changes us in the very act of reflecting. It is an act of self-transformation. The entity that we see when we reflect on ourselves is no longer the same entity that is looking. The object that we reflect on is changed by our reflection. Because of our capacity for self-reflection, we live as fundamentally, radically indeterminate beings. That is, free beings. Our experience of ourselves is the experience of freedom. Another way in which our experience of freedom is evident and inescapable, excuse me, no matter how unfree we are, is that we each must posit for ourselves some notion of the good, some notion of what is the best kind of life that we can live, and then order our actions and pursuits according to that notion of the good. No one can do that for you. You, and only you, have to work out what whole manner of life you think is most worthwhile for you. Liberal education takes this aspect of the human condition as its starting point and tries to give us the tools with which to work out the best possible answer. You'll often hear people speak of liberal education as something that transforms you. And let me pause on that claim, that education, and liberal education in particular, has the power and the tendency to transform people's lives. You know, it's a claim that liberal education shares with self-help, with religion, and with many forms of quackery. It's a big claim to make. But the kind of transformation that liberal education holds out is distinctive and fundamentally different from the possibilities for self-transformation that are offered by self-help, religion, or quackery. Quackery, of course, only offers and doesn't deliver self-transformation. For one thing, the transformative power of education unfolds in as many varieties and configurations as there are individuals in the world. Liberal education cannot have a predetermined outcome. If it did, it would no longer be liberal. Another way in which the kind of transformation that liberal education promotes is distinctive is that it is thoroughgoing. Like walking through a thick fog, it soaks you through and through. Liberal education doesn't just add more knowledge on top of your previous stock. Liberal education rearranges everything else that you know. You don't just end up with more knowledge, you end up with a different configuration of knowledge. Liberal knowledge, in other words, alters the internal proportions of your soul. My own life has been profoundly transformed by liberal education. And I am, of course, not unique in experiencing education that way. I would bet that many of you listening to me have had similar experiences. Let me invoke this experience as it began for one of my intellectual and political heroes, Frederick Douglass. This is a passage from his 1845 autobiography, Narrative of the Life of an American Slave. Let me set up this moment for you. What I'm about to read happens when Douglass was about 8 years old. Douglass had grown up in a plantation as a slave, um, in kind of the rural eastern shore of Maryland. When he's 8 years old, his enslaver, his legal owner, sends him to his brother, that is his master's brother, who lives in Baltimore, in the city, and who has a son about the same age as Frederick. Sends him to live in that household and be kind of a household slave, a servant, and a companion, a friend to the little boy. Douglass writes incredibly movingly about that journey on a ship from the eastern shore to the big city of Baltimore, the big port, the big ships. He gets there. One of the things that immediately strikes him is that the mistress of the house, Mrs. Auld, who's never had slaves before, treats him like a human being, treats him like a little boy. And it's the first time that Douglass has ever been treated by a white person as anything other than an object. And it really has a profound impact on him. One of the things that happens in that household is this passage I'm going to read. Warning about this passage, the N-word appears in it, in the mouth of the enslaver. I'm not going to pronounce that word. I'm going to replace it with the word slave. You'll be able to tell where that word comes up because our American ears are very well attuned to the derogatory slur that is. And it was a derogatory slur back when Douglass used it. So here it goes. Very soon after I went to live with Mr. and Mrs. Auld, he's 8, she very kindly commenced to teach me the ABC alphabet. After I had learned this, she assisted me in learning to spell words of 3 or 4 letters. Just at this point of my progress, Mr. Auld found out what was going on and at once forbade Mrs. Auld to instruct me further, telling her, among other things, that it was unlawful as well as unsafe to teach a slave to read. To use his own words further, he said, if you give a slave an inch, he will take an L. We have a version of that saying now, if you give somebody an inch, they'll take a mile. Right? To use his own words, he said, a slave should know nothing but to obey his master, to do as he is told to do. Learning would spoil the best slave in the world. Now, said he, if you teach that slave, speaking of myself, how to read, there would be no keeping him. It would forever unfit him to be a slave. He would at once become unmanageable and of no value to his master. As to himself, it could do him no good, but a great deal of harm. It would make him discontented and unhappy. Douglass returns to his own voice. These words sank deep into my heart, stirred up sentiments within that lay slumbering, and called into existence a new train of thought. It was a new and special revelation explaining dark and mysterious things with which my youthful understanding had struggled, but struggled in vain. I now understood what had been to me a most perplexing difficulty, to wit, the white man's power to enslave the black man. Now, picture this. Douglass is a black boy. He's grown up among other slaves. He knows black people intimately, and he's one. He knows they're not dumber, they're not weaker, they're not inferior in any way to the white people, whom he knows intimately too. He hangs out in the house, in the plantation house. He's a servant. He knows white people from up close. He knows they're not smarter. He knows they're not stronger. He knows they're not in any way better than the black people. Yet, it is all the white people that enslave and own and abuse the black people. How is this? Why is this? Douglass can't figure it out. And when he hears this little lesson from his enslaver, it clicks for him. He says, from that moment, I understood the pathway from slavery to freedom. It was just what I wanted, and I got it at a time when I least expected it. Whilst I was saddened by the thought of losing the the aid of my kind mistress, I was gladdened by the invaluable instruction which by the merest accident I had gained from my master. Though conscious of the difficulty of learning without a teacher, I set out with high hope and a fixed purpose, at whatever cost of trouble, to learn to read. And he did learn how to read and made his life as a writer and as a newspaper editor and orator, and as one of the most important thinkers and activists in American political history. Now, you might say, that's fine, but today there's no more slavery. Slavery is a thing of the past. It's outlawed by the 13th Amendment. It's true that there is no longer in the U.S. chattel slavery, where you and your children are literally owned by someone 24/7 and forever. But there are other forms of subjugation, coercion, and domination that pervade modern life and that have much in common with slavery. Liberal education, the kind of education into which Douglass saw a window in his acquisition of literacy today, is also aimed at charting a path from slavery to freedom, at somehow transforming you in such a way that you are forever unfit to be a slave. Let me point to two broad domains in which forms of enslavement persist in contemporary life, one public and one private. One pervasive form of subjugation that exists around us is what people call wage slavery. That's when you sell your labor for a period of time and are, during that time, effectively subject to a master. This form of slavery was recognized even in antiquity, when there still existed chattel slavery. Now, I'm not going to get very much into this, but let me say that it's almost taken for granted today that this is okay, that it's some kind of life to sell yourself to servitude for 5 days a week, Monday through Friday, in order to buy the privilege of living on the weekends. But it's not so. This is not the worthiest life for a human being. There is no virtue in that, no expression of human excellence, no recognition of human dignity, but on the contrary, a degrading brutalization of human nature. So it's not education to prepare you and convince you to sell some portion of your humanity for wages. Yes, of course, education should give you skills and competencies that have value in the marketplace and enable you to make a better living than you would without an education. But there is also a higher and a more fundamental calling to education. And in our colleges and universities, that calling is embodied curricularly in what we call the liberal arts. Education should also be about how to be free, about how to live the life of a free individual, not just the life of a hired laborer. So that's one form of subjugation that exists today, wage slavery. There is another and more pervasive kind of subjugation and slavery, and that is when one aspect of ourselves exerts tyrannical control over another. Here, let me quote Jean-Jacques Rousseau from The Social Contract. For to be driven by appetite alone is slavery, and obedience to the law one has prescribed for oneself is freedom. This even more pervasive aspect of servitude has to do with the contradictorily layered nature of our psyche. Freedom, is great, but it brings its own problems. Until recently, many of you lived at home under the governance of your parents. And those of you for whom that wasn't recent, you no doubt remember that one of the shocks of college life is the challenge of self-governance. Many people who fail at college fail not for intellectual reasons, that the material they're asked to learn is just beyond their grasp, but because of failures in self-governance. How do we organize the tangle of psychic forces, conflicting desires, and contradictory impulses that coexist in our mortal frame? You're familiar with them. You want to lose a few pounds, but you want to eat the dessert. You want to be fit, but you don't want to exercise. You want to be on time, but you don't want to get out of bed. Our structure of desire is completely heedless of the demands of logic. We can desire wholeheartedly, genuinely, fully things that are absolutely contradictory to each other. This is our condition. I submit to you that the maximal possibilities for human freedom, once our legal freedom has been reasonably secured, comes from the optimal organization, from the more or less successful integration of our inner lives. When Douglas, listening to his enslaver, recognizes that learning would forever unfit him to be a slave, he's hearing a recognition that education encourages inner developments that transform your life from the inside in a way that liberates and that is irreversible. Liberal education is not a theoretical abstraction removed from how we live our lives. Liberal knowledge is earthly and rooted in the contingencies and dilemmas of life. It involves foresight as well as intuition, calculation as well as value judgment, clarity as well as ambiguity, explicitness as well as elusiveness. Scientific knowledge, which is a different kind of knowledge than liberal knowledge, and it's the kind of knowledge that dominates in the university and in the disciplines and in academia. Scientific knowledge progresses cumulatively. It builds on the discoveries of the past and adds new ones on top of those. We understand infectious disease, electromagnetic radiation, climate change, etc., much better today than we did 50 years ago. And we call this progress. But liberal knowledge doesn't quite progress that way. We don't understand the experience of grief, or how to live with the consciousness of death, or the meaning of love and nobility any better today than we did 100 years ago. The latest war novel is not an improvement on the Iliad. And the same goes for art. Warhol and Rothko are not superior to Michelangelo and Renoir. Art doesn't get better as time goes on. It's worth remembering that universities were established in an environment of information scarcity. Some of us remember when it was a thing to have access to a university library. Sometimes people would choose their jobs or the cities they lived in based on whether they had access to a good library. But we're in a different world now. The least thing that students need today is to be given more information. The biggest thing that they need is some way of judging what information matters and what doesn't. What information is worth giving attention to. Attention, and not information, is now our scarce resource. Students need to educate their attention. Liberal education works by reorienting attention. It uses information, but what matters is the direction towards which the student's attention is turned. That is, liberal education works on the affective disposition of the student. You might remember this quote from Plato's Republic. And if you don't remember it, here's a quote from Plato's Republic. Education isn't what some people declare it to be, namely putting knowledge into souls that lack it, like putting sight into blind eyes. Our present discussion shows that the power to learn is present in everyone's soul, and that the instrument with which each learns is like an eye that cannot be turned from darkness to light without turning the whole body. Then education is the craft concerned with doing this very thing, this turning around, and with how the soul can most easily and effectively be made to do it. It isn't the craft of putting sight into the soul. Education takes for granted that sight is there, but that it isn't turned the right way or looking where it ought to look, and tries to redirect it appropriately. I have a colleague at Columbia whom I heard say once that teaching the humanities, which is sometimes used synonymously with liberal education, not the same thing, but she said that teaching the humanities is the non-coercive restructuring of desire. Like, I love that expression, the non-coercive restructuring of desire. Fundamentally, what liberal education does is this reorientation of the attention, the desire, the direction of the student's soul. Another way of saying that liberal education concerns the redirection of the student's affective disposition is to say that liberal education is about teaching students how to organize their freedom, teaching them to discern what objects are most worth of their attention. So, the book I wrote, Rescuing Socrates, How the Great Books Changed My Life and Why They Matter, you can hear the claim I'm discussing embedded in that title. By the time I started writing the book, I had spent 10 years as director of Columbia University's Center for the Core Curriculum, and many more than that, teaching and advocating for liberal education based on the study of foundational texts. Even though I always recognized the value of liberal education to be rooted in a subjective and personal experience, throughout my time as director of the Columbia Core, I avoided making the case for liberal education with reference to my own life story. My reluctance stemmed from my distaste for the stereotypes associated with the immigrant story, with the rise from poverty and marginality through education. It's not that these things aren't true about me, but that I have been averse to turning those aspects of my identity, of my life, into an identity. In some way, in the same way, and probably for the same reasons, I have resisted a force I have felt pressing on me from the whole culture to define my identity primarily in terms of my ethnicity and the color of my skin. But the decision to write a book making my full case for liberal education caused something to unlatch inside of me. It was suddenly clear that I could only write such a book in the first person and with my whole self in it. My case for liberal education would have to weave together the arguments and insights I had developed over the course of my academic career with an honest examination of my inner and outer life and how it had been shaped by my liberal education. This is what Rescuing Socrates is about. And I hope that you permit me, as I do in the book, to elaborate a little bit on some of the biographical details in my background. I'm an immigrant, came to the United States from the Dominican Republic, where I was born, and grew up in a small rural town up in the mountains. I came to the United States not speaking English 2 days before my 12th birthday. The town I grew up was, as I said, up in the mountains, in the interior, as they say. And it was an agricultural town. It was immersed in the pre-industrial and agrarian rhythms of the 19th century. It was small. It extended 6 streets in one direction, 4 streets in the other. My childhood address was Calle 6, Casa 7, the 7th house on the 6th street. I remember when our roads were paved and when we got running water. At home, we had no television, no stove, no refrigerator, no phone. If you had to make a phone call, sometimes you have to make a phone call. You went to the gas station, the one gas station in the town, where it had the one telephone in the town, and you'd pick it up, and you'd hold it 10 minutes, 20 minutes, 30 minutes. Eventually, an operator would pick up on the other side, and he would say, I want to place a phone call to this number, and you would read out the number, and the operator would dial it and connect you. If there was a fire in the town, that's how you called the fire department. I remember one time there was a fire in the middle of the night. By the time the fire engine got there, the house was burned down to cinders. Sometimes, as a shorthand, I say that I grew up in the 19th century among people who had grown up in the 18th century. So there's a considerable distance, not measured in miles, between there and this podium. The role that liberal education played in that trajectory is the motive force, the little engine that drives my advocacy of liberal education and which gives it its particular contours. I landed in New York City in 1985 with my older brother to join my mother, who had emigrated 2 years earlier. In many ways, we were a typical Dominican immigrant family, poor, not speaking English, and with little knowledge of what life in the U.S. would entail. But having seen enough to be convinced that whatever it was, life in the U.S. would have better opportunities for us than the life we left behind in the Dominican Republic. My mother got and then lost a minimum wage job in a garment factory. I remember quite clearly that the minimum wage salary was $3.35 an hour, and I remember my mother, when she got that job, all of us thinking, that's some good money that we're going to be making. When my mother lost her job, my brother and I moved to a basement room in the house of a distant relative for a few years while Mom fared for herself. We went to the local public school. We didn't live paycheck to paycheck, since we didn't have jobs. We lived hand to mouth. And it was rough going. You can read about it in the book. My point is that when I speak about how a liberal education can illuminate a life, give people unique tools to navigate their inner and outer worlds, and empower them to transform their reality, I speak from personal experience. I mentioned earlier how the term liberal education is not well understood. After I wrote my book, I couldn't for the life of me come up with a title. So I decided to let the people who make a living selling books come up with the title. But I did express my hope that the words liberal education would appear in the title. My hope was not fulfilled. What did make it to the title was the phrase great books. So let me say a word about great books. Let me begin with the adjective great. With reference to book, great is of course a contestable term. We may disagree about what constitutes greatness in a book. Not only that, there's a widespread belief among professors of literature that there is no such thing as a great book. That the designation great is only a way of asserting and perpetuating particular power structures and pervasive forms of discursive domination and exclusion. I'm not going to engage with this widespread belief among the literary intelligentsia, except to say that while the view is based on an important insight, it takes that insight and turns it into an absurd dogma. And we can take the insight without adopting the dogma. We can think of a great book as one that contributes in some outstanding way to the kind of liberal education I have been describing. A great book speaks to our shared human condition. That is, it speaks beyond its immediate historical and cultural context. It is not great because it reflects its specific cultural, historical, and economic situatedness. It is great because it speaks beyond that to something that transcends its historical particularity and illuminates our shared humanity. Moby Dick is not great because of its detailed portrayal of the New England whaling industry. It's great for some other reason. The Divine Comedy is not great because of Dante's immersion in the theology of the medieval church and in the factional intrigues of central Italy's politics. The Divine Comedy is great because in the midst of those trappings, it can reveal something that is vitally meaningful to, say, a 21st century unbelieving Dominican immigrant to the United States. By the same token, it is not Toni Morrison's immersion in the legacy of American slavery that makes her novels great, but her ability to make that human experience alive and accessible to someone who has no historical connection to it. Great works are great because of an evident yet elusive capacity to illuminate our shared humanity. Another characteristic of great books is that they tend to be complex, to speak with many voices, to resist ideological reduction or uses as sources of indoctrination. In the case of great literature, great books are not summarizable. You can only get what great literature has to offer by experiencing it as it is. You have to go through it. It's the experience of it, not the knowledge of what it says, that does the work of literature. The Wikipedia entry on it will not do. As Ralph Waldo Emerson said of Revelation, it cannot be received secondhand. One more word about great literature. And with this, I will begin to wrap up my formal remarks and have some Q&A. We're going to have some Q&A, yeah? Great literature is the absolute best way we have of approaching the experience of what it's like to be someone else. In the form of the novel, I believe that it is the most successful technology ever devised to understand the world from somebody else's point of view. You cannot get inside somebody else's head. The closest thing you can do is read great literature. Through great literature, you can spend hour after hour seeing the world and reasoning through situations with someone of a different gender, class, culture, and time. You know, part of the problem with our technological revolution or revolutions is that they have been driven by engineering breakthroughs and shaped by people with computational genius who can be quite clueless about history, philosophy, art, literature. This is actually one of the reasons why liberal education, while being progressively weakened in the contemporary academy, is in fact more important today than it has ever been. The psychological complexities of human behavior have always preoccupied great authors. And there is something profound to be learned about human behavior by studying great writers. In fact, there is something profound to be learned by reading great literature that cannot be learned in any other way. Great books give us access to truths about the human condition that are not available in any other form. Not in the hard sciences, not in the social sciences, and not in the course of our ordinary interactions with the world. To understand what is ethical, to understand what policies will work, to evaluate the consequences of a new technology, to anticipate how society will assimilate an invention, you need to understand something you can broadly call culture. You can think of culture as a grid of interconnected practices, traditions, values, and implicit understandings in which every single individual is embedded. We live radically embedded in these webs and have no existence outside of them. To understand an individual, you have to understand culture. And there is no better way to understand a culture than through the enduring stories it tells about itself and the arguments that have shaped its understanding of itself. Writing in 1940, the intellectual Louis Mumford, observing the rise of fascism in Europe, criticized Western liberalism for its tepid response and wrote an essay in the New Republic called The Corruption of Liberalism. In it, he said, among many other illuminating things, that unfortunately it is not, excuse me, unfortunately, it is not in Ricardo or Marx or Lenin, but in Dante and Shakespeare and Dostoevsky that an understanding of the true sources of fascism are to be found. Today, as we enter what looks like a new period of great power conflicts, um, I think this insight is useful. You know, when you take the situation in the Ukraine, which is escalating and going in ways that no one is able to predict, how do you make the calculation? Um, how do you make the calculation whether to arm the Ukrainian military with, say, fighter jets? How do you calculate how Putin will respond to that? How do you calculate your next move if a tactical nuclear weapon is deployed by either side? Um, it's not data and analysis that you need, but something about human psychology, about history, some intuition that cannot be reducible to an algorithm or a formula. Let me end with this. Sometimes people say that the point of liberal education is exactly its uselessness, that it is not pursued as a means to obtain something else, but that it is simply sought for its own sake. I see the point of that, but I disagree with that way of looking at it. A liberal education is extremely useful, and we pursue it for the highest of human ends. Put it simply, a liberal education is there to help you find your way. And this is your basic task in life, to find your way. There is, in the final analysis, nothing else to do in your life but to find your way. Not someone else's way, not the way of your role models or your elders, not the way of success, but your way. A liberal education does not tell you what your way is, but it equips you for a kind of self-exploration and investigation of the world around you that can lead to genuine living, to a life of honesty and clarity. That life might include making a lot of money, but it might not. The point of liberal education is not to make you rich. That life might include having an impact on many lives around you, but it might not. The point of liberal education is not to make you a benefactor of humanity. That life might include many friends, or it might not. The point of liberal education isn't to make you popular or affable. But a liberally educated life will be richer than otherwise. It will be more true. It will be more awake. It will be more alive and creative, and it will be more free. To modify a quote from Henry David Thoreau, if a liberal education does one thing, it is to ensure that when you come to die, you don't then discover that you have not lived. Thank you. Raymond, how do we do it now? Jen, how do we do it now? Okay.
So I have a mic, and if you have a question, please raise your hand and I will bring the mic to you. And we would like to privilege questions asked by students. There are many of you in the audience, so please, if you have a question, speak up.
Audience is speechless.
Hi, my question is, would you equate empathy with a liberal education?
I think I wouldn't equate it precisely. That is, they are different things. But I think a liberal education cultivates empathy. because a liberal education concerns reflection on the nature of the human good, that is, a liberal education has at its center the kind of fountain question from which all of liberal education emerges is something like, what whole way of life is most worthwhile for me to live? That question, which is about the human good, is about what goods are worth orienting, structuring your life around in the pursuit of what? That question requires a kind of introspection that forces you to consider what is the human good. What kind of being am I? What kind of being is a human being? And the kind of liberal education that I most favor focus on the study of texts, debates, works of art that have grappled with these fundamental questions, that illuminate your own humanity. To illuminate your own humanity is to illuminate what is human, that is what you share as a human being with other people who are not you. Right? To illuminate your own humanity is to illuminate those fundamental aspects of your existence that you have in common with all humans. And that is one way to describe what empathy is the recognition, which is something that happens kind of at the gut level. It's not just an intellectual recognition. It is the awakening. It is the seeing the commonality with other people. It is the capacity to experience the world from somebody else's point of view. And that capacity, which I think is the highest achievement of an education, to enlarge your capacity to experience the world from somebody else's point of view. There is no mechanism of cultivating that capacity in an educational context better, more effective than liberal education. So I think that there is a very intimate connection between liberal education and empathy.
So my question would be, what would your response be to people who say that because the financial cost of higher education is so high, it's necessary to pursue subjects that are more like directly applicable to the job market?
I would say that education should be free. That is, I would agree that the cost of education is scandalous. It's ridiculous. I would say that indeed, in part, but not exclusively, but in part because the cost of education is so astronomical. Universities, colleges and universities have a responsibility to equip their students to succeed in the job market. Further, I would say that that kind of education that gives you skills with which to get a good job is not something that you do instead of a liberal education, but it's something that you build on top of a liberal education. This is why I make a distinction between the liberal arts major, which is just one specialization like any other. You know, liberal arts major and engineering, they're just two different kinds of specialization. A liberal arts major is different than a liberal education. A liberal education ought to be, but sadly it is not in most colleges, but a liberal education ought to be the common foundation of all the majors. You see, when we narrow liberal education to the liberal arts major, so that the only way to get a liberal education is to get a liberal arts major, we are in fact saying that if you need to make a living, liberal education is not for you, right? If you are a first generation, low income, if you do not come from the the top 5% of income where you don't have to worry about making a living, then you can study liberal education. That is, when we force on our students to choose either a liberal education or a practical education, we are in fact reinforcing hierarchies of privilege in our society. We have to eliminate the opportunity cost of a liberal education, right? A liberal education has to be embedded in the curricular structure of every degree. And And I admire very much what you do here, because that idea infuses the curriculum. Whether, no matter what you're going to do in your last 2 years of college and beyond, you're all going to have a grounding in this kind of comprehensive view of the development of these questions historically. So I would say, get a degree that is practical. Don't do it instead of a liberal education, but on top of a liberal education. And one other thing I would add is that in any field, whether it's a technical field like engineering or graphic design or computer programming, or it's a scientific field, or it's a business field, at the highest level of achievement in any field, you encounter these human questions. You encounter these problems that can only be approached and thought of from a liberal humanistic perspective. So that grounding liberal education is not a detraction, but a way of empowering whatever specific thing it is that you want to do.
Hi, thank you so much for coming to speak here today. My question is, do you think that one of the ways to remedy the failures of liberal education is to spread it down to a high school level and implement it there? Or do you think that it's only successful in a higher education?
Thank you. That's a great question. Yeah, liberal education needs to be done in the K through 12 space, even more urgently, because that is the place where we have universal education. Not everybody goes to college, and while I think that everybody should be able to go to college, no one should be forced to go to college. It should be an option, and of course, it's being decimated in the K through 12 space. I should say I'm a college professor, so a lot of my focus is on liberal education at the college level, because what happens at the college level curriculum sets the curriculum down from there. K through 12 education is organized in such a way as to deliver a student prepared for college. So what we do in the college curriculum is going to have a downstream effect on the curriculum. The other reason why I focus on higher education, besides that, the fact that I work in it, is that higher education has been failing dramatically and shamefully at doing liberal education. Having said all that, there is something special and unique about liberal education at the college level, particularly in the first 2 years. That is, liberal education, as I have emphasized, concerns this condition of freedom that we have, concerns this existential situation where each one of us has to posit for oneself what kind of life we want to live, what is worth pursuing in my life. And the moment when an individual leaves the tutelage of their parents, begins to organize their own life according to their own priorities and their own judgments, that period, that roughly coincides with the traditional college period, is, I think, the most productive and the most seminal in which to dunk, to immerse a student in these questions, in these texts, in these discussions. So there is something, I think, uniquely powerful, uniquely significant about liberal education, particularly liberal education based on the study of great books, by which I mean great works, not just books, art, music. Those works that have most productively grappled with the fundamental question of what it means to be human and what does a human life, a flourishing, complete human life looks like, right? Grappling with those texts, examining those texts, and talking about with those texts with people who are different from you and perhaps have had different experiences from you, at that point, I think is the most fertile, is the most rich, is the most kind of a productive space in which to do it.
Excuse me.
You mentioned that no one should be forced to go to college, and I think on that topic, the question that I had was
Forced to go to college?
no,
Okay,
no.
okay, good.
It was recommended, but so I think something like one of the problems I think people face when it comes to reading some of these great books is the fact that a lot of courses tend to try to fit as much curriculum into each semester or each year as possible. And for that reason, I think information is less absorbed than it is like glossed over just for the sake of kind of just putting things down for an exam or a paper. And I guess I was just wondering what your solution to that would be. Like, what would you say to people who feel like maybe these books aren't being appreciated for what they really have to offer?
It's a good question. It's kind of a pedagogical question. How much reading is too much? How many pages per class can you like effectively manage, effectively use? There's obviously no answer to that. But I can say a few things. One is that there's a big range of what that is. That is, students, people in general, will rise or descend to your expectations. The expectations that are set by the community have a huge impact on how much a student is able to usefully absorb. So there isn't a clear set point, and it's a community thing, right? It's not like the professor decides to assign more. There's got to be a whole, we're in this together, this is what we do, a culture, right? So that's one thing to say, and the range is very, very large. The other thing I would say is that as a teacher or as a faculty member who oversees curriculum, you make decisions about kind of what approach you want to pursue. The program that I used to run and the program that's been most influential for me does kind of a maximalist approach. That is a lot of reading. I think you can do a minimalist approach where you do few readings that you read very carefully and at great depth. And that's also defensible and useful, and you can get a great education that way too. You can choose a kind of kind of a midway in which you do kind of moderately heavy reading, but not kind of as much as you can cram in. Those are decisions that I think emerge from the curricular culture of any particular institution. And every school, I think, is going to find itself in different situations. How many points is the class? What kind of course load do students have? What level of commitment and support is there from the rest of the faculty? Is your own class out of step with other classes, et cetera? But clearly, a crucial question that I think has to be answered in light of the specific circumstances in a given class. Yeah.
Thank you.
I thank you very much for your talk, and it made me think about certain responsibilities that fall on instructors, professors, the prioritization of providing a liberal education as opposed to a scientific education to begin with, and how many and how often is that done. Yeah. Also, I wanted to kind of raise this issue of indoctrination or coercion, which is, I think, kind of an undercurrent of what, or at least behind a lot of what we've been talking about today, or you've been talking about today. How do you facilitate, you need good faith actors as professors to present material in an open way that doesn't necessarily have, or maybe it's unavoidable in some cases that certain professors will have a certain hierarchy of goods. How do you do that in an actual, like in a very real world where the professors have perspective in one way or in another way, and how is that project achievable, I guess, in the 21st century with these biases, whether it's a question of what texts we teach, or how we teach the texts, or what priorities we put into the texts?
Yeah. I think the difference between liberal education and indoctrination is that a liberal education lives in the questions, and indoctrination lives in the answers. When you think you have the answer, and what you're teaching students is the answer to the question, you're not doing liberal education anymore. If you think you know the answers to the fundamental questions of human existence, congratulations. But I suspect you're deluded. I suspect you're in the grip of some ideology. Moreover, even if you have worked out answers to those questions in your own life, those answers are only meaningful in the context of your own trajectory and you working them out. That is, you can't transmit, they can't be had secondhand, to quote what Emerson said about revelation, right? You can't just give the answer to someone. Those answers are things that someone has to work out in their own lives. And it's something like psychological insight. Psychological insight can only be had by the subject. It cannot be given. A therapist, a psychologist cannot give you the insight. Can ask you questions, can get you to talk, but the insight is something. It's a kind of self-unfolding that happens. These questions that animate liberal education are such that the answers can't be delivered by somebody else, but have to be worked out by every individual. And they have a nature, I think, of always being provisional answers. There's another quote from Emerson where he says that all truths are initial, none are final. I think that's the spirit of liberal education. So as a faculty member, I live with these questions too, and the way that I answer those questions and live with them is different today than it was 10 years ago and that it was 20 years ago. And I'm not there to get students to where I am. I'm there to equip students to go where they're going, to get to their configurations and their versions of what kinds of lives are worth living. And that's fundamental in the practice of liberal education, that the human good, which is our ultimate subject, is, I think, inherently contestable. And that's part of what you learn in a liberal arts education class. So we're not in the business of giving answers, but in the business of equipping students to ask better questions, orienting them in such a way that they can work out provisional, working answers to the questions in their own lives. Yeah.
Hi. So my question was, when you were talking about wage slavery, is there a way to avoid that? It seems even if you have a good liberal education, it doesn't necessarily free you from the having to work 5 days a week just to buy a good time on the weekend.
Yeah.
So what do you do to?
Yeah. So this is, Henry David Thoreau called this like the cardinal philosophical problem, and about which so little is written. How do you make a living without like sacrificing your life? So I don't think that they're formula answers, right? It's one of these things that you work out in your own life, right? Can you find a sustainable way of making a living? Can you find a way of making a living that expresses your freedom, that expresses your beliefs, that expresses the ways in which you find meaning? That is like a cardinal challenge for all of us to find. And for some people, that might involve work that looks very much like traditional work, like coding or something. For some people, it's going to look like something that going off into the woods and being a farmer, like Thoreau tried to do for a few years. But that commitment to a life of freedom, to a life where Marx has a term for this. He calls it unalienated labor. There's a kind of labor where the product of the labor is alien to you and kind of oppresses you. You don't own it, you're not invested in it. But there's a kind of labor in which the labor expresses yourself, your meaning, your values. We are creatures that like to make things and produce and generate things. So finding a mode of life that at the same time sustains your basic needs. You know, that's the great challenge. And you're not gonna read that in a textbook. You are going to work that out. And I should say that this thing of wage labor is quite interesting because I think the paradigm that most people have for wage labor is a kind of menial, mechanical, routine, kind of low-wage labor, which is obviously that too. But there's some very, very high-paying wage labor. I have some friends who, you know, make a lot of money being miserable in their lives. And who, not because somebody is imposing this on them, not because necessity is imposing on them, but because they have locked themselves into a structure of value that demands constant effort, constant work, constant stress. Even if it's very lucrative, they find themselves in a kind of wage slavery. So I think a liberal education, when it's successful, prepares you for the kind of creativity, for the kind of authenticity, for the kind of clarity about your values that permits you to create that kind of life. That's why it's about a whole way of life. Liberal education is about a whole way of life. There's a quote from W.E.B. Du Bois that I love, an essay in which he says that the true college will ever have one goal. The true college will ever have one goal, not to earn meat, but to know the end and purpose of that life which meat sustains. So working out that kind of life, I think it's what I mean when I say about finding your way, right? This education is about finding your way. Students often ask me, for career advice or this and that, and I never have any good advice to give them, except to do things that you love doing. Do things that are meaningful to you. Let that be the primary criteria for what you do. Not some calculation about where you want to be 5 years from now, where you want to be 10 years from now, but some authentic expression of your values. Let that, if you have that organized the way that you live, then you're going to end up doing something that's like that. You're going to end up in a place. Wherever you are, you're going to be in a place where you're doing something that's meaningful and valuable to you. A liberal education, an education opens up in our society, an education opens up vastly more possibilities for that kind of work than not having an education. But even so, let me tell you one anecdote. It's hard to be going on about this. As I mentioned, I have young children, a 4-year-old and a 1-year-old. When our first child was being born, my wife somehow bumped into some guy whose little business is to child-proof homes. So what he does, he comes to your house with a clipboard, and he looks around, and he notes all of the places that are like dangerous to a kid, and what you need to do to fix them. And then he says, okay, this is everything that you need to do to child-proof your house. You can do it yourself, or you can pay me, and I can do it for you, and this is how much I would charge you. So this guy's name is Howard. So when my wife found him, I called Howard and say, hey, Howard, can my wife and I both work full time. Can you come on Saturday morning to do this? I said, no, I don't work on Saturdays. I can you come in the evening? No, I don't do evenings. I can be there 9 to 5 on a weekday. I loved that. Like, he could make more money if he came on a Saturday. He could make more money if he came in. But no. And this is something he invented, right? This is something he does. He gave up some job that he had and made this little way of life. That's how he makes a living. There are 10,000 things like that. But it takes a certain kind of honesty with yourself, a certain kind of creativity, a certain kind of focus to find, what your child-proofing apartments business is going to be. Yeah.
I think we have time for one more question, but I do want to remind folks that you can just go to the great room after we're done here and join us in continued conversation over the reception. But we do have time for one more question.
I would say that predominantly in my liberal education career that most of my learning has been mainly focused on Western values and Eurocentric teachings. And I was going to ask that, do you believe that colleges, when implementing a liberal education, that they should stray away from such teachings and try to expand,
From what teachings?
like more Western value and Eurocentric teachings? Do you feel that colleges should try to,
Them?
yeah, like, or try to implement it in a way that they would stray away from these subjects, or try to implement some in other regions?
No, I don't think there's any reason why to stray away from the Western Eurocentric tradition. I don't think there's any reason to only study those traditions. I think the wider the scope that you can manage to take, the better, the more rich you are. I would say that the so-called Western tradition has a special claim, I think, in the curricula of universities in societies that have emerged from that tradition. You know, our political institutions, our ethical norms, our system of justice, our language, our religions, our idioms for artistic expression in architecture, in painting and music, all of those things have a history. All of those things have precedence and an evolution that have shaped them into what they are today. And in America, that means that's largely Western. Our institutions, our values, our norms, our systems of justice come from this particular trajectory. So I think that there is a good reason to have that trajectory, that tradition, be central to the education of a student who is in this society. If you're studying in China or in India, there's a different tradition that informs and feeds and shapes those cultures. So those should be primary there. Yet that's not enough, right? The world in which we live today, I think maybe 100 years ago that might have been enough. Today that's not enough. The world in which we live is interconnected. It is a global culture. It is a place in which we cannot live in isolation anymore. So I think exposure with the, roughly speaking, I would say the classics, the foundational works in different civilizational traditions, I think is enormously important and enriching. I spent all of my formal education just reading and teaching in the Western tradition, and have on my own just sought an education in non-Western classics and non-Western philosophy. And I can't tell you, it's invaluable to me. The way I live my life, the way I think about the world has been enriched in such fundamental ways by that exposure, by that study of the non-Western tradition. And it has enriched, contextualized, deepened my understanding and my insight into the Western tradition.
Much.
Okay.
Another big round of applause.